I'm Andrew Patterson from interest.co.nz. Welcome to another in our business success series. With me today, Miles Valentine, the founder of Zeacom. Hi there, Miles.
How are you, Andrew?
So, Miles, tell us a little bit about the origins of this business when it started in 1994. What was the idea that you actually had, and the genesis, I guess, of the business?
Well, my previous business was a telephony platform reselling company. PBX is the old terminology, and we had built that business up over a period of about 5 years, sold it to Ubix, had quite a significant and enforceable restraint of trade. We couldn't do phone systems again, but the area of call centres as they were then, contact centres as they are now, was outside that restraint. And it was an area that we knew there was a real need, because we'd been selling the phone systems that had a very small subset of that functionality within them, and it was pretty inadequate. So we basically, and that's a long story which we won't go into, but through a series of combinations of fate, we found a developer. He was a guy I'd actually sold a phone system to many years prior. He was working for a company that didn't want him any longer, or didn't see the value in that part. We picked him up, and that was the genesis of Zeacom, or voice technology actually, as it was in those days. Changed the name when we went to America because there were two voice technologies already over there, and so really it was a fairly natural progression, still within the communication space, which is really how it started. Obviously, New Zealand initially, we had strong relationships with NEC, who were our old PBX supplier in the previous business. They had quite a high level of demand in Australia. Started exporting to Australia in '96. Frankly, we're nowhere near ready to do it, but good news was we did it anyway. And yeah, that's really how it started. So,
and at that point, the contact centre, or the call centre business, as perhaps better known by, was really just kind of in its infancy. It was just getting started. Very
much so. There were our first sale was to Tech Pacific. A second one was to PC Direct. And third one was to Ansell, the shipping company, and they were really the first people that they were technology companies that had a help desk. They were distributing calls on the basis of who's been off the phone the longest got the next one, and we came along and said, look, we can do it a lot smarter than that. We can give you reporting, we can give you information, and frankly they lapped it up. It didn't work, I have to say, for the first 6 months. They were all very tolerant. But I think they kind of expected that it wouldn't really work. But it gave them enough that they realised they wanted it, and they were prepared to wait. So it was a very infant. It was definitely in its infancy, and really help desks. Some of the telcos had it, power companies, those sorts of the bigger entities were the only people that had a call centre, because they only handled voice in those days. And they were all deemed to be a big cost. Well, they were a big cost. You got 30, 40, 50 people sitting in a room all day, and they all want to get paid. It's a lot of expense. So so they were quite motivated to make more efficient use of those people. And I remember we sold the first one, sold the second one, and I said to my partner at the time, I said, look, if we sell 3, we might actually have something here. And we did. So I sold the third one and was like, okay, this could work.
And this is software based, so effectively you are designing solutions for the clients and tailoring software for that.
No, it was all a standardised product. Although every time we got a new customer, of course, they'd want more things, so we'd build that into the product and then we'd put it across all of it. So by the time the business was sold, we had 3,500, 4,000 customers. They all had an identical product. You can't manage customised software across that sort of size space. So no, it was a consistent standardised piece of code, but your point about it was software. That was the critical differentiator for us, in that it was software that sat outside of the telephone platform and added the smarts to the telephone platform. So it was the software that was the intelligent part. The phone system, we actually turned it into a dumb animal and just told it to transfer a call and play music on hold, and that's all it did. So yeah, the key differentiator we had was it was software. Bad news was that most telephony managers at that point, telecom managers as they were then, weren't used to paying maintenance fees, because they didn't ever buy software previously. They bought telephones and cards and things that you put in and out of boxes. So there was a real transition that was going on through that period.
And when you look at it today, how different is it from that business you started almost 20 years ago?
Yeah, a lot. Certainly that point I was touching on then, the buyers have completely changed. The telecom manager's gone. It all sits inside IT now. The actual technology is completely changed and is about to go through another very large change at the moment with Microsoft entering the space. We've seen a whole bunch of the big players get out. Ericsson are out, Nortel are out, or it's out of business. There's the telephony space is going through an enormous amount of change now, and frankly it has been for the last 10 years. From the old what they call TDM to IP to voice over IP to SIP. But I mean all technology is changing like that, and these were, the telephony industry was actually relatively slow up until this point, but now it's become purely software based. It's about to accelerate a lot. Yeah.
And will this interface with Skype and so forth as we continue to go down that route?
Totally, and that's a perfect example of a software-based telephony. I mean, Skype is a telephony communication platform. It's just huge, and that's the sort of scale, and that's the change. One of the changes that Microsoft are bringing to the whole thing. That's a very disruptive acquisition, and it's going to bring about immediate and huge change. Yeah.
So when you look at the business today, has it accelerated faster than you expected, or has it been about what you expect?
No, it's probably what we didn't realise initially. Contact centres are quite hard. And hard in a good way in that they've got good barriers to entry, but they're also hard to scale. To sell tens and hundreds of contact centres, you need a lot of expertise, which means that it's very hard for people to get into the business when they're not in, and the existing players have some good advantage. But it also means that it doesn't actually really ramp up. And so no, that was probably a disappointing aspect of the business, and in fact one of the things that led us to our sale was we realised that really the scale wasn't there, and scale could only really be achieved by aggregating with bigger contact centre company, and that's actually what happened for us. Yeah.
And that was the reason for the sale, because obviously companies, when they make these decisions, ultimately get criticised for exiting too early. But had you reached a point where it was a natural part of the evolution process for that to occur?
Yeah, that was one of the reasons only. When companies are established, particularly with venture capital, which we had ACC were the largest shareholder in the company, AMP. And a couple of smaller venture capital firms. I mean, they all put money in on the expectation they're going to sell. And that's how they get their money out. That's their business model. So really, any business that has got venture capital and it has an expectation it's going to be sold one day or listed. But frankly, in the New Zealand market, listings are a hard option, particularly for a software company. So that was one of the reasons. I mean, the shareholders were old, they were tired. They'd been in for 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, which for a VC is a long time. So there were a whole bunch of reasons, and probably half a dozen. I mean, sort of the realisation that it really didn't scale, age, being able to get a good return on their investment. You add all those things up, and they were nearly running down the hall with the pens in their hands.
And yet, when we look at companies like Xero, they have been successful. So did you look at IPOing as even a possibility? Well,
Xero is an interesting example. I mean, the fundamentals of Xero don't validate the enormously good share price that they've got. Rod has done an outstanding job, getting that aspect of the business to where it's at. But he listed sort of pre-revenue. Unfortunately, by the time listing came around, we were revenue. We had revenue, and so there's a lot more to analyse and look at. If you're going to do a listing, you either want to be when you're tiny, or when you've really got a track history, and so Xero were I think a fairly unique case, and Rod, with his background and his credibility, was able to pull that off. Frankly, my board at the time he did that were a bit incredulous and a bit, he'll never pull it off. And we did. It was like, well, guys, he did. So why weren't we doing that again? But the reality was, when we went and spoke to the share brokers, they took it back to the fundamentals and said, okay, well, you're making this amount of money, the growth rate's only 30%, it's not really that exciting. It's like, okay. So yeah, that was one of the reasons we didn't.
Do you think that sort of thinking will have to change over time, though, if we are going to address this issue of growth within and retaining that within New Zealand?
Well, the share broking industry is obviously got a lot. It's a relatively small industry. It's got a lot on its plate. The New Zealand investors are, certainly at the moment, driven by dividends and yields and really Xero and Diligent. Diligent's done a very good turnaround and a great job recently. They're pretty much exceptions. So whether the New Zealand share broking industry will ever get enough expertise to follow and analyse and really be able to value software companies, I'm not sure. It's a question of scale. There's just not enough software companies around to justify that investment from a share broking firm's perspective, I don't think. So yeah, it's a bit of a cart before the horse.
Let's talk about the other issue on the other side of the coin, is this idea of the government putting money in and subsidies and grants and so forth, and then the exit. What are your thoughts about that? Selwyn Pallett obviously raised before Christmas this idea that there should be a convertible note option or something the taxpayer should have something back. How do you feel about the decision and the process that you went through?
I think it's a bit... the word selective, but a convertible note as a tool or a mechanism changes the capital dynamics of any firm. In just about every shareholder structure, that would be a much more difficult decision, because you're bringing a shareholder in, and in effect, depending on the terms for the conversion, obviously, and it's certainly one way you can do it, but I think the whole that whole area, if there's going to be a change, it needs some pretty careful thought, because you really do change the dynamic between, okay, well, here's a grant that can actually help us grow, and when we got ours, we very consciously went out and hired 6 developers. So that's what it enabled us to do, to actually further accelerate and further invest into the development. But we would have analysed it an awful lot more closely, and we'd looked at grants in previous years, and frankly they'd been just too hard. They were just too cumbersome. They were too difficult. There were too many strings. So we didn't bother. And in fact, we gave up on a number of applications over the years, and it's only been in recent times when the grant process became more streamlined that it was really, really justified, because we looked at some of them and realised we were going to spend half the money at administering them as we were in getting them, or in receiving them. So I think it's a little. I think it's a bit simplistic just to say, look, a convertible note's the way to do it. It may be one way, but I don't think it's the sole option. And as I say, I think it'll change the dynamic, the willingness of people to accept that money, which means that they won't necessarily make those investments. So,
what about the broader issue of, New Zealand has this aspiration to kick more into a high-tech gear and to look at this sector and expand it more? What do you think needs to change to adjust the macro settings to reflect that aspiration?
Well, an awful lot of it comes back to capital, and we have a shortage of medium stage and later stage capital. And I think there's a bit of angel money around now. There's more angel money around. There's more seed money, but and I think that's an area where that's where it all starts. Everything starts small. So the more you can, the more numbers of entities that can be started through more availability of seed and angel capital, the better. When you get to that next stage, and like I was just actually sitting with a company before. They've actually just raised $1 million, and what I think is actually they've done very, very well, but they really need 3. Hard to find 3. In fact, they really need 5, frankly. They're not going to find that sort of money in New Zealand. Just about not going to find that money in New Zealand. They might get lucky. They really are going to need to migrate their corporate structure to America. And they're going to have to go to Sandhill Road, and they've got a good chance of being successful, provided they've made that migration across, and obviously satisfied a whole bunch of other criteria. But at that point they stop being a New Zealand company, and again, this is part of the criticism. I mean, there was a recent one just the other day about a company who moved to Singapore. I mean, I think there can be some rules around that grant money, that yes, the development does need to stay here, and there are some criteria, but unfortunately, when you go for that bigger capital, you are going to move your corporate entity at least up to the US market. Now, development, as we did, and it makes a lot of sense, we kept in New Zealand. Still makes a lot of sense, even at 84 cents on the dollar. But we did that very, very consciously, and it does work. But capital is coming back to your question. Capital is, I think, still the biggest issue. We have the expertise, we have the ideas. We're willing to travel, we're willing to go into new markets, but we've got to be able to fund that willingness, and that I think is still the biggest issue that's there, and it's not an easy answer. I think there's been some great initiatives done by people like New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, the Ice House, the Geeks on a Plane. I was going to say promo's not being fair to it, but that whole campaign they did just before Christmas was, I thought, really good. They brought down some high caliber people, ran a really good show for a week. I know impressed a number of the VCs because I spoke to them, and they were like, there's some good stuff here, but the reality is there's good stuff 3 miles down their road back home, in Silicon Valley or in New York or in Boston where they're based. They don't need to come to New Zealand to find a good company. That's a problem, so it's a great start exposing ourselves to people like that, but as I say, they've got a lot of choice. They're spoilt for it.
When you look back on Zeacom today, what are you most satisfied with?
I think I'd have to say our US success. That I think was the hardest stage. It's a big, good, difficult, expensive market to get into, and if we hadn't been well funded, and God bless AMP at the time, that if we hadn't had AMP's funding, we wouldn't have survived in the US. But that was getting to the stage where the US became more than half of our revenue. We had a good solid 50-person team up there. That was very satisfying. I think that's probably the most satisfying sort of, and it took a long time. I moved there in January 2000 and had 7 years there, and I think about that time the revenue was nearly 50-50, but then it continued to accelerate our growth. Unfortunately, the currency started to move a bit at that point. That meant that we were as the currency grew, it meant we made more profit, but our revenue growth slowed down because we always accounted in US dollars. So it was a bit of a natural hedge, but the growth in the US was the most satisfying thing, I think.
Do you remember losing some sleep?
Oh, don't even talk about it. Actually, I didn't lose sleep. I actually slept pretty well. I went grey, but no, actually, I slept pretty well. I used to wake up at 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, and go to the bathroom and think, look, there's nothing I can do about it now, and I'd go back to sleep. But the days were fairly intense. I remember one particular spot on my way home where I would park and end up having long discussions with New Zealand around all sorts of things. I mean, literally hours and hours on the side of the road. A lot of late nights getting home. I remember that pretty well. But no, the sleeping part I was actually okay on. I don't know why, but I just was.
And where to for you now?
Well, it's been a nice sort of. I left Zeacom formally in December, and I've had it's been a nice summer, 6 or 7 weeks, and just starting to get back into a few things and get a bit of exposure with some more New Zealand companies. Excuse me. I'm off to the States next week to start to, actually rekindle some relationships and talk to some people, and maybe some selective directorships, a little bit of consulting, some free advice for some smaller companies. I've got a couple of years with my daughter still in school. As soon as she's out of that, I've said to my wife, well, you brought me home to New Zealand, and I'm probably going to be spending a lot of time in America. So as you said to me, you're welcome to come with me, and I'll be saying the same thing to you. So but more for the next couple of years at least, get sort of stuck back into the I guess the corporate scene, but in a more advisory type role as opposed to a day-to-day responsibility.
So Miles, of course, it's now in the past. Zeacom, something you've created, something you've signed off from officially, but obviously plenty of potential for you and for the company still in the future.
Oh yes, yeah. In fact, I think the sale has given an awful lot more potential for the company, both for the employees, the opportunities within the broader group, and the channels that they opened up for us. I think it's been very clear for Zeacom that it's definitely been a step forward.